Hello, everyone. Guess what? My friend Brian McLaren is here because he wrote an amazing book. And I read it and I was like, Brian, this is an amazing book. Do you know how many times I've thought in the dark nights of the soul moments, do I stay Christian? And you want to know one of the people I'd like to talk about it with is Brian McLaren. So he wrote the book and we were like, we should do a book party. No. We want you to actually read it first. So what we're going to do is provoke you by giving little summary engagement to conversations for the big 4 parts of each book. And then in a few months, you'll be able to pop back on here and we're going to have live interactive sessions answering questions week after week on Sunday nights. And it's going to be really excited because we want you to actually read and engage the book and then shape our conversations by sending us the best questions, struggles, stories, and things as you process the book. In this session, Brian's going to introduce part 1. So if you're by yourself or with your reading group, buckle your theological safety belt, because this is the one that will make the most religious among you uncomfortable. And for some of you, you might shout hallelujah and then feel weird because the answer to do I stay Christian in part 1 is no. So how's that for an intro, Brian?
Oh, that's great, Trip. That's great. And I just want to say thanks to you for doing this. And I just got the first actual copy of the book in the mail over the weekend. So
nice.
Nice to have it in my hands.
Mine's on my iPad.
As you know, this is my 20-something book. And, but in many ways, this is a book that I'm so glad we're going to be able to invite people to actually read it, then discuss it, then interact with us about it. Because I think for an awful lot of people, as you know, this isn't just, one of the many questions we have. It's really one of the questions that goes deepest to our own psyche and sense of identity and every social belonging circle that we're part of. And for many clergy who are grappling with this question, it goes to the heart of their profession and ability to provide for their families and everything else. So it's a big deal. And there's a lot of pain. And I guess that's maybe where I want to start by saying a book like this comes out of some pain and addresses pain. And I'll just say, speaking personally before we jump in, I think the first time I actually thought, do I stay Christian? I was somewhere between 8 and 11 years old. And for me, the issue was evolution because I loved science so much as a kid and I read so much science and evolution made so much sense. And when I found out from my Sunday school teacher and my parents that I was not allowed to believe in evolution, I just remember having this feeling, well, I guess when I grow up, this religion is not for me. I thought evolution just made beautiful, beautiful sense. And so, that's a tough thing for a kid to have to grapple with at such a young age. And of course, I know for other people, it's different issues. For one person, they come to terms with the fact maybe that they're gay and that's not accepted in their church or whatever it is, that we, from a very young age, just can be a very deep identity crisis. I just was on the phone yesterday with a pastor who left the pastorate a few years ago, and he told me that he's pretty sure that most days he's an atheist now. And I mean, this guy was a megachurch pastor, and to hear that, I just think reminds us that this is out there, it's in the air. So that's the occasion for the book. Yeah. And in writing the book, I felt, maybe here's a way to say it. I did over 200 weddings in my years as a pastor, and I unwittingly memorized the Episcopal marriage liturgy. And there's a line where the clergy says, marriage is not to be entered into unadvisedly or lightly. And I think the same these days goes true for holding Christian identity. It shouldn't be entered into unadvisedly or lightly. And knowing what your weight as a Christian brings into the world these days, retaining Christian identity shouldn't be done unadvisedly or lightly. We better do it with our eyes open and take it seriously. And so this first third of the book takes the title question, do I stay Christian? And basically says no. And here are 10 good reasons why. So maybe should I just jump in and give a sort of overview of some of those?
Yeah, because I think that giving an overview would be helpful, because we want anyone in a group and stuff to provoke conversation, and we want anyone that's using it to go read, and so take it away, Brian.
Okay, so chapter 1 is titled "Because Christianity Has Been Vicious to Its Mother," and a lot of people talk about the terrible thing that happened in the early 4th century when the bishops of the Christian church made a series of deals with a fellow named Constantine, and they see that as sort of the point at which this really nice religious movement went bad. But if you go way back into the late 1st century and early 2nd century, this Jewish movement had this change in identity. And there's all kinds of theories on why this happened and historical data that can inform this. But this Jewish movement opened up to become a multi-ethnic and multi-religious movement, and then became a largely anti-Jewish movement. And the history of Christian anti-Semitism is the subject of chapter 1. And I put that first because I think it's one of the earliest historical issues, and it's one that Christians have lied to themselves about and remain ignorant about. I just saw a headline as we speak. You're still in UK territory, and there was just a headline about church leaders in the Church of England acknowledging, was it 3 centuries during which Jews were kicked out of England? From I think it was the 12th century for a few centuries thereafter. And it was, you can sort of imagine it. I guess people in America can imagine it, watching this overturning of Roe versus Wade, kicking out textbooks. In my state of Florida, our governor kicked out math textbooks that he said taught critical race theory. I mean, but we're watching this sort of purging to prove your purity and loyalty. And one of the ways this was done periodically in Christian history was by mistreating Jews. You prove how devout you are by mistreating Jews. Of course, it's happening now in the U.S. with mistreating transgender children and their families, and somehow people feel holy for doing this. So if we take that seriously, I end that chapter and I say something like, if this were the only reason, it would make me have serious questions about this religion. Second chapter is because of Christianity's suppression of dissent. And this deals with, first, chapter 1 is how Christians treat Jews. It's sort of mother religion. Second chapter is how Christians in power treat Christians who think differently. And so how dissent was punished. And part of chapter 2 was so ugly that I stuck it in an appendix at the back where this could have been a whole book. I mean, it's a morose, grotesque subject, but to look at the history of church-sanctioned torture of heretics, it's way worse than most people realize. Third chapter is because of Christianity's high global death toll and life toll. And what I mean by this is the harm that Christians in power have done to people of other religions over whom they have power or whom they're adjacent to. And what I ended up doing in this chapter is I took the Crusades, which everyone has heard of, the several hundred-year period in which there were a succession of military reconquests of the so-called Holy Land, and then realized that right as the Crusades come to an end, colonialism begins. And in fact, the Crusades and colonialism are far more linked than we realize. And so through a very big chunk of Christian history, then we have this violent treatment of the religious other. And so those first 3 chapters, they, I hope people have the fortitude to keep reading, because for a lot of people who maybe have never heard any of this, it's going to come as a shock.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me reading it is how there's a way of telling part one, the answer no, as a series of examples of how power has become perverse.
Yeah.
And that at the heart of if you want to understand saying no, it's because you're repulsed by the very kind of power, like anti-Semitism, who kills their mother, right? To your siblings in part two. And then your neighbor in chapter 3, and it goes worse. It's not like it's there, but when was it for you that these connections became not just part of a litany, but you started to notice that symptom around the threat of power that has shown up in in your other works?
Well, first, that question flashes me back to a couple of moments that you and I maybe were at the same places at the same time. Being brought up in an evangelical background, everything we were so focused on correct doctrine. And the history of Christianity was the history of the preservation of correct doctrine. Of course, we had a mythology that everyone used to be evangelical and then they kept messing it up, and they used to think like we did, and then they would go bad, but which certainly isn't true historically. Because this was the assumption, I was part of it. And I thought if we could just have better doctrine, we would have better behavior. And there was this now kind of famous gathering of the early emergent movement. And there was a fellow named Alan Roxborough there. And Alan and I had become friends. And Alan, who's, I don't know how many years older than me, but older enough to be kind of an older brother. He basically took me aside, and I could tell he was disturbed by some of the things he was hearing. And he said, Brian, you and your friends are way too focused on intellectual history and theological history. You're not nearly focused enough on social history. And of course, by social history, he meant how power is used in history, among other things. And he said, for example, postmodern is really post-Holocaust. That the Holocaust is a major occasion for the postmodern moment. And so I started thinking and writing about modern versus postmodern. And a moment came for me in the middle of giving a talk. I was in Pennsylvania. I picture exactly where I was. I was giving a talk that I'd given many, many times about the idea of modernity and postmodernity. And it dawned on me that the beginning of modernity was the beginning of colonialism. That if we want to look at even the Reformation, 1518, if we take that as a birthday, is not that far from 1492. And suddenly I remember realizing modern is colonial and postmodern is an attempt at being post-colonial. That was a big moment for me. I'm interested. Did you have moments like that helped you see that?
Yeah. I mean, the two that immediately come to mind, and one we talked about quite a bit previously, was the church's response to 9/11. Yes. And if on the days that I want to say no, and then I feel the echo of the church's silence to the witness of people like Gandhi and King. And then the way we've done with their legacies, what the church did with Jesus. Then I think to like the examples you give in the first 3 chapters, like what we did to our mother, then what we did to each other, and then what do we do with our neighbor? Underneath all 3 of those is so much an express denial of Jesus' invitation to a way of love. And I know I have the denial in me. It's just like, it's not just that we don't do it. It's we don't even attempt to do it. We don't tell the truth about what we are doing. And then we invest so much energy into making sure we can put King and Gandhi and Jesus on a placard of an institution who's uninterested in taking their witness seriously.
Yes. I mean, so much more we could say about this, but that leads very much to the fourth chapter and the fourth reason that I think people say no to the question, do I stay Christian? It, in a sense, turns to inside issues. These first three chapters focus on how we treat on sort of abuses of power that bring harm to people. But the fourth chapter is because of Christianity's loyal company men. And once you're inside on the Christian religion and power structure, you realize that there's this kind of institutionalism that goes deeper than I think we often realize it. And it has to do with this sort of insider, almost mafia-like mindset that we protect our own and that we act on behalf of the guild. We act in behalf of the profession. We act in behalf of the power structure. And we know our place in it. We've got to preserve it. And when you start to see how people get rewarded in religious systems, take something out of you. And I say this having been a pastor for 24 years, and I remember the times I felt it sucking me in. I remember this one time I treated somebody so badly. And as it happened, I sort of felt, I don't want to be this mean. I guess I have to because I'm a Christian leader, So at any rate, that issue of how institutions sort of rule you, it can be pretty disillusioning.
So I know we're attempting to be shorter with these because we want them to read and then sing questions. So I have two more questions, and the first one is, which of the other two on here were the most difficult to write? Like, when you look at the list of why you say no, because where these come from in a pastor's heart, and you obviously were a pastor and then became a pastor to lots of people through your writing, are stories. So are there particular ones that were the hardest to write because you love and care for people and you understand their story in some sense is informing and behind the chapter?
Yeah, well, actually, chapters 5 and 6 are probably the ones that would answer that question. Chapter 5, because of Christianity's real master, which is money. This realization of the power of money in the whole Christian religion is so deeply disturbing. We certainly, and so much could be said about how it's worked out in history, but that's pretty disturbing, especially because our founder had some pretty strong things to say about you'll either love God and hate money or love money and hate God. And then chapter 6, because of the white Christian old boys network, the power of white patriarchy. I think that's been one that, I was this sincere white kid who grew up, with the luxury of whiteness, that I didn't have to think about what it meant to be white. And a huge part of my adult life has been, and especially because of my age, I think I lived the first half of my life before a lot of white people started paying attention to whiteness. And so in the second half of my life, as I've had to pay attention to that and see the way it's encoded, not only in the US Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, but it's encoded in Protestant theology and in post-Council of Trent Catholic theology. Yeah, those are two that went pretty deep.
So I wonder if this is similar to you. When I was reading this and as you were writing it, I thought through how the cumulative effect of being the person that goes to their minister that were born Christian, get in a Christian space and then wrestle with these questions, or being the minister and doing public theology. And then you meet people and they're like, you're fine. I don't know about your religion. Insert one of these chapters. Some of the ways these have impacted me have been a number of subtle shifts. Like, one is do I say Christian? I can say, if I muster yes, I didn't want to go, but you don't have to, right? That could be the beauty of other religious traditions or something like that. Mm-hmm. Then do I say Christian? Yes, but it may not be best for you. right? Like the harm and pain and shame connected to this group. Like I've got to the point where I don't want to prescribe it to anyone and everyone. And I started to think of how the ability to say yes and to stay for me changed when each of these no's were no longer something I had to conquer before my next sermon.
Yes.
And I just wonder, thinking of people reading your book as a group, be it another member in the group having one of these and wondering, or perhaps reading it in a space and acknowledging that they were reading this book waiting to get to the yes chapters because they can't acknowledge like how close some of these ring true to them. What's your kind of, do you have pastoral wisdom on what to do with that kind of inherited dynamic we may have brought in?
Yeah. So I mentioned performing a lot of weddings before. Let me bring an analogy to marriage. So you get married to someone and you idealize them. And then once you get married, you find out, that they're human beings with limitations like everybody else, and that they have, trigger points, and they have weaknesses and character flaws and immaturities and wounds and all the rest. And if the way you stay married for a period of your marriage is by pretending those problems aren't there or living in denial about them, right? I think it's going to make the fall even harder later on. And eventually, I think what happens in every marriage, my wife has had to do this with me, I've had to do this with her, where we say, okay, if I want to stay married, I've got to be honest about who I'm staying married to. I know them well enough now that if I'm going to stay married, I've got to love them as they actually are. And so I think my pastoral guidance would be, if you keep thinking, oh, Christianity just has this one little flaw, and if I can tweak it by next Sunday, we're going to be fine, you're going to set yourself up for disillusionment after disillusionment. And it's going to make something more toxic in your relationship. But if you can learn to say, no, this is our actual history. Let's be honest about this. What's so interesting for Christians about this is we have the Hebrew scriptures, where the Hebrew scriptures are pretty honest about the faults of their history. They don't cover them up. They write whole books about them. And they have these group of people called the prophets who continually remind them of what scumbags and scoundrels they've been in the past, right? So I think we need that in the Christian religion really bad.
And I think that kind of space, if you're going to say you have to learn, but also we've also done marriages and realized that the healthiest thing for those individuals was not staying married.
Yes.
And I just think that if we're going to figure out how to be followers of Jesus in a multi-religious, multi-ethnic world, part of it is going to recognize that the actual call of being a disciple of Jesus in community is not something that's it's not going to fit everyone at every moment, at every time of their life. And sometimes because of the family you found yourselves in, you'll never want to be in a family again. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the situations of, or one of the kinds of conversations I hear more and more are people who, because of any of these reasons, be it the big ones or the more intimate ones, who leave Christianity or reject it. The kind of trauma that process or experience or recognition had, that for me to insist, oh, well, yes, but look at how the church has responded to anti-Semitism after World War II, and like, have you read Jürgen Moltmann? I think everyone should, by the way. But, like that sometimes that very response that for you might have helped you address some of this. If you don't know the pain and experience of the other person, it could feel threatening and harming as opposed to an invitation. And I think that's something to remember for especially for conversations in a group of friends or in a faith community that people could be having with the group.
I don't know what the figure is now, but a few years ago in the United States, there were 75 million adults who were born Christian and no longer identified as Christian. 75 million out of 330 or whatever million. So that's a lot of people, and it's, growing every day. So there are people going through this process. Tripp, I know our time is up. Let me just make one other comment about this. I'll just mention the final 4 chapters. Chapter 7 is because Christianity is stuck, dealing with our being stuck in a kind of toxic theology. 8th, because Christianity is a failed religion, meaning it promises personal transformation that is way easier to promise than actually deliver. Chapter 9, because of Christianity's great wall of bias. I call this constricted intellectualism, that we have enormous intellectual activity to defend what we already think. And then chapter 10, because Christianity is a sinking, shrinking ship of wrinkling people, which is the problem of an aging demographic. And I'll tell you the thing that happened to me as I was writing this. I came to terms with something consciously that I don't think I'd come to terms with. After you look at the harm the Christian religion has done in its first 2,000 years, I think its greatest harm could still be in its future. I think the worst things, Christianity has done some horrible things, and it could exceed them all in the next decade. That makes me say that this religion is too powerful to not have a reckoning with its past. And that is one of the things that I really hope happens in part 1 of this book, that we say, if I'm going to stay a Christian, I had better be realistic about the dangers, and I better commit myself to try to prevent those atrocities from happening. And if I'm not going to stay a Christian, I as you said, I have reasons for that. And in some ways, I have an offer to make to the Christian community. Address these kinds of issues, show me the money, in a sense, show me the change, and we can talk again. But until that happens, I'm not sure I really want to have that conversation.
Yeah. Anyway, that was helpful. And we hope all of you doing this either by yourself or in a group, when you get done reading each section or as you go along, make sure you send us your questions, stories, challenges, and such, because we're real excited to let everyone go through the book and then get to spend time together live for a few weeks, tackling the actual things that come up in your own experience. Because as you heard, this whole section is deeply shaped by the fact that we don't ultimately say no. And we I feel like I thought of 5 or 6 other chapters confused, where you're like, I understand. But that wasn't how I didn't start that way. I got there by the impact of listening. That's what we're really hoping the goal of this whole project is that the book becomes an opportunity for us all to listen in small groups, and then for us to get to listen and engage with all of you. So,
and I'll just say too, as I hope as people are reading, if there's a paragraph that really strikes you, underline or mark it or note it somehow. And one kind of question that I'd be really interested in responding to is if you say, give us the paragraph or give us the sentence and why it struck you, what bothered you about it, or what you just want to, ask for more engagement about. That way we'll have some, some very specific passages we can relate to. I think we know that we can't give great pastoral care, at a distance like this. But on the other hand, if people are willing to bring out anything from their own personal life in this that they feel safe in sharing, we'll try to respond to that as fellow human beings in this too. So I'm really looking forward to those interactions.
Me too.